Hello, welcome back to another episode of Open Workshop. If you're new here, this is part of the Edit With Me series that I've done over the last few years on this channel, where I basically edit work on camera and we kind of like talk about line editing. For this video, which is extremely overdue, I have already made the line edits because I have already filmed this video many months ago. I lost the footage after I had filmed it. I had actually lost footage for a bunch of videos. So that's why I haven't gotten around to making this video, even though I know you guys submitted these, I think back in November. But I finally have the time and I'm in the right mental space to refilm it. And I do apologize that it has taken me an extremely long time to like work up the mental capacity to refilm these. November hit, like for the rest of last year and at the start of this year, I was revising a book with my agent and it was just like a lot of other things in my life were just kind of happening all at once. So I'm extremely excited to be able to finally make this video. This is by far my most requested videos. I did get a ton of submissions. I have picked two. Before we actually take a look at the excerpts, there were three things that I just kind of wanted to talk about on a high level. These are things that you'll find most writers kind of don't necessarily notice about their writing at first, which is totally fine. That's part of the writing process. So the first thing I'll talk about is show, don't tell. Of course, but it's this very like vague golden rule in writing. But I find that there are two ways in which show, don't tell manifests the most, I think, in a lot of beginner writing. And also certainly when I was starting out writing, when I look at a lot of my old stuff, the first one was emotional exposition. So this is instead of showing a reader how a character is feeling, there's a lot of emotional exposition that's a little too heavy-handed. So you're just telling a reader how the character is feeling. You're telling a reader how to feel about a scene. If they're angry, they'll just say this character was angry instead of crafting the scene around contextualizing the anger. The second part of show, don't tell that I see a lot is character backstory and world building. Give too much information about a character within the first scene of a book. And obviously, you know, break the rules if you want to, break the rules if you're doing it for a reason, but also generally you don't want to be info dumping things about your world and your character within the first scene. So a first scene is just meant to, you know, give you a taste of what this story is going to be like. And we don't necessarily, you know, if a character has a tragic backstory, we don't need to explain what that tragic backstory is on page one. We might not even need to hint at it all that much. I think that there are a lot more important things you can do in your story in a first scene. The second thing is overemphasis on visual. Another craft rule I think that could be helpful for writers. Remember to write with a range of sensory details, especially for those of us who are very visual writers. Our descriptions can become overly focused on character appearance or on setting description or on action choreography, and we neglect all of the other senses like smell, taste, touch. It can lead to descriptions that are just a lot of stage directions. Don't have to necessarily think of your scenes as scenes in a movie. You can in some ways, but I think the thing that separates prose from all other visual mediums is that you have the opportunity to balance external description with internal character reflection. So when you're choreographing a scene, you need to be in a character's thoughts in some way. Otherwise, the reader will feel like they don't have access to the perspective character. You know, I'm not saying that your character has to be monologuing in their head for pages at a time, but you need some of that interiority in order for a reader to connect deeper with that character, with their vulnerabilities. And the third thing is just specificity. I think this is another thing that just takes a bit of time to hone as a writer is when you're describing literally anything, whether it's an emotion, a character appearance, setting description. You want to watch out for things like familiar phrasing, cliche metaphors, idioms, going deeper with your adjectives, going deeper with your verbs. So we'll get into it when we actually look at the excerpts, because I think that these are the three things that I talk about most when I do these types of videos. So yeah, I will link the whole Edit With Me playlist down below. All right, so this first submission was an anonymous submission. It is a novel excerpt from a YA dystopian. I actually did get quite a few YA dystopian pieces, or what felt like YA dystopian, so I felt like just picking one would be a good vibe, since it seems like something's in the air right now. But again, I know this was submitted back in November, so if the writer is watching this, thank you for submitting. The scene was pretty long, and for the interest of time, I won't do the whole thing. A lot of my feedback, I think, will apply to the whole scene, so we'll just read the scene all together first, and then I'll show you guys my thoughts on making some of the edits. The smell of sulfur was heavy in the air under the burning red sun. Jack had long since stopped flinching at the sound of gunshots, but the weight of the two revolvers in his hands was still heavy, still burning away at something in him. Despite all of that, he kept shooting at the hounds. "Do you have them all yet?" Rat asked. Jack gritted his teeth as the van jerked to the side. He was standing on the back seats, poking out through the sunroof. "Not yet," he shot back, then shot a hound that had gotten too close. The rest were still hot on their trail. If we just kind of look at this opening, the first thing that we'll probably notice is that there is repeated use of the word shot. So that was the first thing that had stood out to me, was repetition. So typically, you want to find, if there's an action that a character is doing throughout the scene, you want to be conscious of finding different ways to describe that action. Also, saying he shot back as a dialogue tag because he's replying to the other character, I think is probably not the word to use here, just because it gets confused and muddled with the other usage of the word, which means to literally shoot the gun. The sight of them still made him feel sick sometimes, despite just how long he'd been doing this. When he fell asleep, he could picture the curve of their jaws, their canines, their bloodshot eyes, more machine than animal. He dreamt about them, but not as often as he dreamt about roaring fire, about losing everything. 4 years. It had been 4 years since his world had fallen apart, and 6 years since the world itself had crumbled. 4 years of being on the run, chased by hounds and hunted down. So this information about Jack's backstory and maybe these characters have been struggling with over the last 4 years, we don't need this in like paragraph 3 of the first scene. You have an entire book to, or at least an entire first act, pace out that information for a reader to maybe put together the pieces of what Jack's backstory is. I like the physical descriptions of the hounds that are chasing them. That's always good. I would go deeper with the descriptions. I think it'll be a lot more interesting for a reader to be able to learn that as they progress through the first act of the book or the first half of the book. He shot wildly at the mass of snarling, writhing bodies, some of them already half dead. Already he could smell death and decay, and Jack was unsure that if he were to turn around and look back inside the van, he would have seen Scott clenching his fists where he thought no one could see them. Even for him, the stench of it was almost unbearable. The van jerked to the side again, and Jack steadied himself with hand on the roof, winded and panicked. So we have a mention of a third character in this van, and I think at this point I had been wondering about where everyone is positioned, who is driving the car. We know Jack is, I think, poking out the sunroof, but then there's also this character, Scott. I think that this is a really interesting detail that Scott is clenching his fists, thinking no one can see him. That is a great character detail that hints a lot about maybe Scott's personality, or raises questions about maybe what the dynamic is between the three characters. So I like that detail. I just would have set the scene for how everyone is positioned in the car much sooner, because I'm not sure if we even have gotten any stage directions like that. Anyways, we'll go through the edits later. Do you mind at least trying to drive straight? He grumbled. He didn't hear Rat's response. There was a hound closer by the side of the van, and he shot at it, missed, then shot again and again and again until its skull wasn't recognizable underneath the blood and gore. That sentence, I think, is one that I think could really benefit from, again, more specificity, more details. We did learn up here that they are more machine than animal, so I'm not sure why they're bleeding. Are they a biological creation, or are they a robotic creation? You know, if you can describe when you're shooting at this thing, what does it look like when that bullet makes impact? What happens to, how does the body kind of fall apart? Things like that, so the image is a little bit more evocative. Guilt was a strange thing. Jack didn't feel it often, but when he did, it was like being hollowed out. Some days he didn't recognize himself under the bloated, yellowing sun. I like bloated, against the sharp, jagged peaks that were painted against the horizon, and he couldn't tell if that was a bad thing or not. If it was for the better that he had changed, that there was a discernible divide between who he was and who he had been before. So I think we're pulling out of the action a little bit too much and a little too far. I think that's another thing to be conscious of in terms of genre conventions, because especially with dystopians, there's usually in a dystopian world a before and after. Like there's a society that has had some kind of like societal event that has happened that has sort of split people's lives into the normal days versus dystopian nightmare that they're living in now. This feels like a little bit too much familiar phrasing when you say something like there was a discernible divide between who he was then and now. So I would stay away from explicit language like that, and again, just don't worry about backstory in an opening scene. I think stick with your action, stick with character details that hint at the dynamic between the characters. I think those details go a lot farther for engaging your reader than trying to do too much like world building and too much backstory, because we don't know these characters yet. We're not connected to them yet. We aren't invested enough to necessarily care about what their past was until we get to know who they are right now, what they're struggling with. Jack kept shooting, ignoring the buzzing in his ears. He tried not to think about before too much because there were more useful things to think about. He couldn't look back, not when he had to focus on survival, on just making another day. It helped almost to have something to anchor himself to, something besides the crushing sense of grief that he found himself lost in sometimes. It was easier that way. It was almost easier that way. Are they gone yet? Scott asked. It took Jack a moment to realize that they were, that he'd been shooting at the comet trail of corpses they'd left behind. He scanned the ground again, making sure that there weren't any signs of movement, any signs of life amongst the dead. He and Scott made that mistake in the beginning, equating injured with dead, thinking that dying meant the same thing as being unable to still hurt them. They'd learned quickly enough, at least. That's an interesting sentiment to hit here. This is not the end of the scene, but I think we've gotten a good enough picture of sort of what's happening. So we'll dive into the edits in a sec. I like that sentiment there where it's like you're hinting at the fact that these characters have been hardened by their past experiences. When we go through the edits, I'll show how we can sort of contextualize these emotions a little bit more so that we're not necessarily spoon-feeding to the reader how these characters feeling and what the sort of emotions that they're grappling with. So the first edit that I made here, the smell of sulfur hung heavy in the air. The first thing I did was I just took out the smell of. I think that's actually implied. You know, when you think of sulfur, you think of something that's already quite pungent. Sulfur, heavy, I think it already evokes smell inherently. Instead of was, I picked a different verb here. Saying that a smell is hanging in the air is a little bit familiar, but I would say that it's a little bit of a step up from was. Was to be verbs, those are one of those things that a lot of creative writing teachers will tell you, take out your to be verbs, take out your to be verbs. My writing prof in university, she made us literally do an exercise one day where she was like, take your scene and take out all your to be verbs, which is obviously very dramatic and drastic. but she just kind of wanted to teach us about choosing stronger verbs. I think about that day every single time I sit down to write, and every single time I use a to be verb in my writing, just quite often. I still use them quite often. Sulfur hung heavy in the air. I chose beneath because I liked it better. It's not important. And then I cut out burning because I believe there was a repeat of burning and then burning here. Something was burning away at him. And I just think burning red sun, it wasn't necessary. I think I liked the image of beneath the red sun a little bit more. It's cleaner, it's equally as evocative. You could pick either or. You could pick burning sun, you could pick red sun, but I don't necessarily think you need both. This second sentence I rewrote. So originally it was, Jack had long since stopped flinching at the sound of gunshots, but the weight of the 2 revolvers in his hands was still heavy, still burning away at something in him. Burning away at him, I thought was a little bit too familiar. I just cut it out. I simplified this to, Jack gripped his revolvers tighter. The gunshots were soundless to him now, had been for a while, and after 3 hours, his hands were starting to numb. I think I added this time indicator because I was curious how long they had actually been chased prior to the start of the scene. Has it been 3 hours? Has it been a whole day? Despite all of that, he kept shooting at the hounds. I just cut it out. I think it's one of those things that's also implied. The original line here was, do you have all of them yet? Rat asked. One thing that applies to the entire scene is your dialogue. I think dialogue is one of the best ways to introduce character dynamics to a reader, because the way that characters talk to each other immediately indicates to a reader the nature of their relationship. I felt like, do you have all of them yet? Might not be reflecting the urgency of the scene. So depending on what their relationship is like, depending on what kind of person this character is, you could go for something that's a little bit more urgent, familiar, that reflects the danger of the situation, the panic that everyone's feeling. One option that I wrote was, you've a shit aim or what? Rat hollered over his shoulder. Tell me you got 'em all. It implies a lot more about what this character's personality is. Obviously, you don't have to use those exact words if that's not actually what his personality is, but that's just an example. Always go much, much deeper with your dialogue. I think banter is a really easy and quick way to characterize your characters and their dynamics with each other. Jack gritted his teeth as the van jerked to the side. He was standing on the back seats, poking out through the sunroof. Yeah, one thing I said here was that I think this seems like an establishing detail that should go first in the sentence. Not yet, he shot back, then shot a hound that had gotten too close. The rest were still found on their trail. The rest is a little too vague. I would like to know how many that he can see. Oh yeah, the other thing is that I changed the dialogue Rat asked to Rat hollered over his shoulder because in my mind, I assumed that Rat was driving the car or driving the van. And I think that that's something that you should establish for the reader. Helps a lot with the characters, like visualization of, especially because it's such a chaotic scene. For this paragraph, I wrote perched on the back seat. So you have the establishing detail first. Neck straining through the sunroof, just for a little bit more specificity. Jack fired his revolver in quick succession. The hound clawing at their tires crumpled to the ground. A dozen more galloped against the burning sky, full speed toward them. He grit his teeth. The things that I did to this paragraph, very simple. I took out the use of the word shot. We have to find different ways to describe the action. Some more specificity about what happens when he shoots the hound. Crumples to the ground. Saying the rest, we specify there were about a dozen that he can at least see. Then we get to these paragraphs here where we kind of are like getting a little bit of interiority. So sight of them still made him feel sick. I just wrote the sight still sickened him. Less words. All of this, despite how long they'd been doing it, 4 years, it's been 4 years since they were being hunted. I just cut them out. If you wanted to still kind of put in an internal reflection here, I just shortened it to this one sentence. The cave of their jaws, their daggered canines and bloodshot eyes, hunting them at every waking hour, visiting him in his sleep. I think it conveys the same thing as him feeling haunted and him, maybe having been doing this for a while, but you don't necessarily have to give all of the details to the reader at once, but just condensing it into one sentence, leaving a lot more up for interpretation because, again, we're only like 3 paragraphs into the scene. He shot wildly at the massive, I highlighted shot again because we're using the word so many times. He shot wildly at the massive, snarling, writhing bodies, some of them already half dead. Already he could smell death and decay, and Jack was sure that if he were to turn around and look back inside the van, he would have seen Scott clenching his fists where he thought no one could see them. Even for him, the stench of it was almost unbearable. I wrote this paragraph and I think I just wanted a little bit more stage directions and a little bit more detail. I said, the snarling mass trampled over the corpses. I think it's a very evocative image to imagine the hounds that Jack is shooting at. There's so many that when he shoots at the ones that are nearest to him, the ones that are behind trample over the bodies of the ones that he's just killed. Like, it just feels like he's being inundated. Lurching the van off balance, Jack cursed, then ducked inside to reload, where he caught a glimpse of Scott hunched over, white-knuckling the steering wheel. Oh, it looks like I assumed that Scott was driving instead of Rat. White-knuckling the steering wheel, mouth downturned as if in poor resistance to his own nausea. The stench was less bearable for him, though he was far too stubborn to ever show it. I just added a little bit more there to the detail where we mention that Scott is clenching his fists. The van jerked to the side again, and Jack steadied himself with a hand on the roof, winded and panicked. I think this is fine. It looks like I rewrote it to Jack leapt to his feet again, emptied his revolver in another hound. The van jerked viciously to the side. He yelped, steadying himself just barely with one hand on the roof. Here, I was tinkering with the dialogue. I actually thought this line was fine. Just to make it a little bit more familiar, I changed it to, "You mind at least trying to drive straight?" He grumbled. He didn't hear Rat's response. There's a hound closer by the side of the van, and he shot at it, missed, and shot again and again and again until its skull wasn't recognizable underneath the blood and gore. The guilt was a strange thing. Jack didn't feel it off him, but when he did... Okay, so originally the line was, it was like being hollowed out. It was always like this, like being crept up on, stalked by a silent predator. I think you could probably come up with a better line than this. I think I was just suggesting it as an alternative to being hollowed out. I think it's still a little bit too vague, whereas this one, at least a little bit more specific. But looking at it now, I almost kind of want to cut it out. I also think you can go without this detail. Yeah, this is a take it or leave it. I'm inclined to honestly just cut this. I wonder if you were to do something like this. Just cut this out. There was a hound closer by the side of the van, and he shot at it, missed the shot. I would also rework this line. Until its skull wasn't recognizable underneath the blood and gore. It looks like I didn't make an edit here, but I would kind of go deeper here with this description and maybe describe just a little bit more visual about what the body looks like. I think you could even go without this as well, and then you just cut to, the guilt was a strange thing. Some days he didn't recognize himself under the bloated sun. It looks like I took out yellowing because I felt like bloated sun was already strong enough. So sharp, jagged. This is one of those instances where for efficiency, I don't think that you need to say both sharp and jagged, so you just pick one. Some days he didn't recognize himself under the bloated sun, against the jagged peaks of the mountains. Okay, I added this. Jagged peaks of the mountains following them across this desert, the only constant in their cursed new lives, along with the hounds themselves. And then I cut out this part here where it goes on about survival and grief and how it was easier to just forget. Instead, again, I just kind of condensed it. The interiority here is good, like the kind of reflections that Jack is making here about guilt and grief are interesting. The edit that I made, perhaps that was its own blessing. It left no room for grief or regret, only survival, a thing to shoot at, a thing to run away from, a purpose. Just enough of it, at least, that he could strain his eyes against the glare of the next day and claw his way toward it. So this section here, I honestly think that it's doing the same thing that the original phrasing was doing in terms of like reflecting on this sense of like, there was a before, now we're living in the after. But you just kind of find different language for it so that it leaves a little bit more room for interpretation for the reader. Are they gone yet? Scott asked. Okay, I just added a stage direction here. Scott asked from the driver's seat. Things like this is important for the reader. I think sometimes writers forget to add these kinds of details because in our heads we're like, oh yeah, that's where the character is, but then we don't actually describe it. I do this all the time in my writing. The original line when he asks, "Are they gone yet?" So I edited this to, Jack stared at the comet trail of carcasses they'd left behind and massaged the ache out of his wrist. I think comet trail was something that the writer had used in a previous description, and I liked it. I thought it was very good here. Stared at the comet trail of carcasses they left behind and massaged the ache out of his wrist. He reloaded his revolver. They will be. I think that this paragraph, the way that I interpreted it was like how hardened Jack and the rest of the people have had to become because of what they're struggling with, the circumstances that they're living in. But you'll notice that I didn't use this paragraph because I don't think it's necessary, and I think that a dialogue exchange like this, following an internal reflection like this, combined conveys the same emotion of Jack being desensitized, Jack being hardened, but it's still rooted in the action of the scene. That is the end of this excerpt. Again, thank you so much to this writer for submitting, and now let's take a look at excerpt number 2. So the next excerpt is a novel excerpt from a contemporary adult novel. And this was submitted by @themakaylalynn on YouTube and socials. So thank you so much for submitting this. Let's look at this paragraph here. We watched our mothers play in the pool when the sun was high and the pungent smell of cedar and drying rain drifted through the screen door. I remember I really liked this opening image here. I immediately just had so many questions about this character in this scene. We watched our mothers play in the pool. Through the screen door, mingling with the laughter of grown women's mischievous youth, renewed by sticky warmth and chlorine, we were captured by their radiance as childlike giggles burst through the lapping of chaotic waves and calculated splashes. It was a chorus unlike any other that we could be responsible for, even on our best days at the neighborhood pool. Together and without the knowledge of our presence as we blissfully watched on, they were free to be as useless, weightless, and selfish as they pleased. I almost didn't want to imagine it any other way, not yet aware of the corruption that occurs to one's memories when dreams meet reality and the needs of life drown out the joy of wanting. So a lot of really interesting language here. Some of it reads a little purple, and I only say that because we are missing some context. I remember one of the first questions I had was like, is this a retrospective narrator? I really liked the emotion in this line. I just wasn't sure. I didn't know enough about these characters to be able to like feel the impact of that line at this point. I'll show the first couple edits that I made to these first 2 paragraphs. So we watched our mothers play in the pool. I loved this opening line. When the sun was high and pungent, cedar drifted through the screen door with the drying rain. The edit I made here was their mischievous youth rebirthed in the sticky heat and chlorine and laughter. I use the word rebirthed here because there's a lot of like allusions to youth and age, the juxtaposition between generations. Like there are these kids that are watching their moms in the pool, and it just feels like they're watching them in a very like voyeuristic way. They're like seeing them age backwards because of just how youthful they look playing in the pool. So I felt like rebirth was a nice word to use here. I took out grown women's mischievous youth because I don't necessarily think we needed it. I also thought that we were captured by their radiance I kind of liked the flow without it. I didn't think it was necessary. It felt a little bit familiar and it took me out of the scene. Calculated splashes threw me off a little bit as well. I think it's a little bit too much description. I think that we're getting the sense that they're playing in the pool. I don't think that you need to continue to describe it. This line was really interesting to me. It was unlike talking about their laughter here. It was a chorus unlike any other that we could be responsible for. It made me think about do these kids not see this side of their mothers that often? It raised some questions about the dynamic between the mother and their mothers and their children, because it's like we could never make our mothers laugh like that kind of thing. And the reason that I cut it out is because as we progress through the scene, we get some of this context about the relationship anyways that I almost felt like the paragraph was fine without it. And without the knowledge of our presence as we blissfully watched on, they were free to be as useless, weightless, and selfish as they pleased. I like this line. I think it's really interesting. The small edit that I made here was, together, splashing beneath the hot rays of summer, they were free to be as useless, weightless, and selfish as they pleased. This is just a bit of a tonal thing, take it or leave it. I just kind of liked the phrasing a little bit better. I think it felt cleaner. I almost didn't want to imagine it any other way, not yet aware of the corruption that occurs to one's memories when dreams meet reality and the needs of life drown out the joy of wanting. So as I said, I liked the sentiment of this line a lot. I just wasn't sure about the overall function of the whole paragraph. I feel inclined to cut it out. And if I were to make an edit here, okay, what about something like this? So we say, I didn't know it then, but this would be the most sacred memory I'd ever have of our mothers, one still uncorrupted by reality before the needs of life drowned out the joy of wanting. Live without this part of the phrase, to be honest, but if you really want to keep it in, I think that this just reminds us of the retrospective narrator, and I think allows us to be a little bit more flowery, because I think the power of a retrospective narrator, because they're from the future, they have knowledge that their present self doesn't. And I think it makes the transition into this line smoother, but that's just my opinion. My mother was one to enjoy things, but never enough to exist in a state of enjoyment. Her smile always lit up a room on Christmas morning when a gift was placed tentatively in her lap, usually with the unease, as the giver worried they didn't do enough for their matriarch. This is very formal, this part here. Paying any mind to material items, her gratitude was always just as shrill as her protest. I like that line a lot. She would only accept things if she could return the favor, gift, act of service. It was never enough for her to bask in the glory of being given something that she secretly desired. That it always had to have a price, and my mother never allowed for that price to remain unpaid. Yeah, I think this line on its own already serves the function really well. I don't know if we need the rest of this. The edit that I made here was, my mother was one to enjoy things, but never enough to exist in a state of enjoyment. Love that, keep it. Her smile always, I don't love lit up a room. You could say commanded. I think both are a little bit too cliche. I almost want to cut it out, but that's up to you. On Christmas mornings, when a gift was placed tentatively in her lap, it was often with a certain unease. I also cut out this line here, being worried they weren't doing enough for their matriarch. Matriarch is a very formal word to use here, and I think you could go without it. I cut out always wondering if you'd done enough. I think that was implied already in the language, so I took that part out. I kept her gratitude was always just as shrill as her protest. That line is great. It was never enough for her to bask in the glory of being given something. I kept it, but I think you could also cut it if you wanted to. This next line here, this was her legacy and the lifelong journey I knew at an early age that I was not meant to carry for the both of us. This is also one of those lines that feels like it has no context. I feel like we've established that there's a retrospective narrator. We've established that this is the nature of their relationship. I would just go without this line. As someone who's written an entire book with a retrospective narrator, what I have found in my editing is that if you overuse lines like, I didn't know it then, but blah, 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 or this would go on to be blah, 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 you can probably only get away with that once a scene, if that. So I would watch out for lines like this and just make sure that you're not doing it too much. Okay, so this is where the shift in the scene happens and we're oh, that's what's going on. This time, she was finally allowing the sun's rays to bake the water that surrounded them, cocooning their languid bodies in sparkles. The shimmering was almost too bright for us to catch the exact moment, but the chill that spread down my spine was too unrelenting for me to forget its origin. The second my mother's best friend, Miss Jessie, swam close enough to wrap her arms around my matriarch, I knew that. I'm not sure if the use of the word matriarch is intentional here. If it is, you can ignore me, but I will say it's if it's just being used as a synonym for mom or mother, I don't think it's necessary. I think you can continue to say mother, and I would be consistent with how you use mother or mom. It seems like the narrator has been using mother, so I would just go with that for the rest of the scene. I knew that the act was truly and finally priceless. My mother wasn't turning down this gesture, nor was she throwing herself forward to provide her own sort of intimate offering. With the waves barely breaking around her arms as they gently brushed the water's surface to remain afloat, Mama was a picture of serenity. Oh, so we use Mama here. Okay, that's interesting. I almost want to use Mama for the entire scene. I think that already does a lot for the voice, because my understanding is the character is a child. So I think if you were to use Mama throughout the scene, it contextualizes the child narrator. I think it adds a lot to the dynamic between the narrator and the mother. So my recommendation would be to just use that to refer to the mother for the entire scene. Miss Jessie caressed her cheek with her free hand as she used the other to sweep through slithering black curls that draped across my mother's shoulders. Just as I shifted my weight to lean closer to the screen, desperate to catch every expression that passed between them, a light touch startled my senses when a clammy hand grabbed the few fingers it could tear away from my fist. So one thing I am remembering about the voice in this excerpt is that there's too much description. You don't need to describe, and it could be intentional, but something to consider is that you don't need to describe every single action in a scene. So shifting my weight to lean closer to the screen instead of just saying, I leaned closer to the screen. A light touch startled my senses when a clammy hand grabbed the few fingers it could tear away from my fist, instead of saying, a clammy hand startled me, pulling me back from the screen. What happens when we over-describe simple actions is that our word count gets very long, our pacing gets very slow, and our sentences might get muddled, readers might get tripped up on it. Wincing at the closeness of the touch, the low-pitched inhale beside me forced my attention back to what existed beyond the screen door. I had nearly forgotten my companion was near, but as our eyes remained transfixed on our loved ones, I would just say our mothers, the comfort of knowing that an accomplice was just as engaged in stealing memories that didn't belong to us felt as overwhelming as it was natural. Very interesting sentiment here, but I think too many words. So one change that I made to this paragraph here was we briefly go into a memory here and into the retrospective narrator. Takes us out of the immediate action of watching the pool. So I think what I found was that we sort of needed a transition sentence. So I would say, but for once in this pool, as the sun baked the water and cocooned their languid bodies in gemstone sparkles, she allowed it. She as in the mom. We could say Mama allowed it or something. So instead of all of this entire paragraph I just rewrote here into 3 sentences. But for once in this pool, she allowed it. She did more than allow it. In that moment, the sun flared so bright against the water, it could have blinded us, but we saw it anyway. Miss Jessie swam close and wrapped her arms around my mother. It was no hug. It went beyond embrace, beyond my own comprehension, something closer to an offering. Mama, still and shuddering, was the picture of serenity. There's nothing wrong with this sentence here. I think it's a lot of words, and I think what you're really focusing on is the witnessing of this hug, this gesture, this touch that Miss Jessie gives to the mom, that even the kids, as kids, can recognize that it is something much more than a hug, and that it is having this effect on the mom, that she just looks like someone that they've never seen before. Again, what you'll notice is that I simplified the language, and instead of describing every beat of action, with one hand Miss Jessie caressed Mama's cheek as the other slithered through the black curls across Mama's shoulders. Just as I shifted my weight to lean closer to the screen, desperate to catch every expression between them, a clammy hand yanked me back by the wrist. A low inhale returned our attention to the pool, through the strange realm past the screen door. Transfixed once again by our mothers, I felt some inexplicable comfort in knowing I had an accomplice right then, as if I wasn't trespassing on these memories all alone. I think the 2 paragraphs convey the same thing, but you just kind of get to the crux of each paragraph faster. I really, really enjoyed this entire scene. It goes on for a while, but I think it's such an interesting and specific time period that the writer has chosen, and I really, really enjoyed it. So that's it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching this video.